It is done. The world is saved. You played your part well, Desmond. But now it's time that I played mine. Hello, and welcome to Visions of the Past, an Assassin's Creed lore podcast. My name is Andrew, and I'm glad to see that you have found this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the Isu woman who gave us that quote, Juno. Before we talk about Juno's history within Assassin's Creed, I think it's best that we talk about where that character comes from, where she comes from a historical context. But when you talk about Juno in that historical context, we have to realize that she was a member of the Roman pantheon. Considered the goddess of marriage, pregnancy, and childbirth, she was also the queen of the gods and part of the Capitoline triad with Minerva and Jupiter. Juno was also said to protect the finances of the Roman people, and as such was the patron goddess of the royal mint. The month of June is named after her, and it was considered the most favorable month to get married in because of her status as the goddess of marriage. I won't go into her specific myths or the ones that she was a part of, but in them, she was the sister wife of Jupiter and the mother of Mars, Hebe, and Vulcan. The birth of Mars is interesting, as he is said to have been conceived after Juno was impregnated by a flower. Juno is often seen as the equivalent of the Greek goddess Hera or the Etruscan goddess Ione, as they all share numerous similarities. Within the games, Juno is a part of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Assassin's Creed 3, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and is mentioned in Assassin's Creed Revelations, Assassin's Creed Rogue, and Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And she is a major part of the Assassin's Creed Uprising comic. Within the game, she was voiced by Nadia Virtue. She was born sometime in the year 2195 of the Isu era, or roughly 75,111 BC. Juno was born to the Isu Saturn within the Illuminat caste within the city of Haiyan. Sometime before the human uprising, Juno would marry Aita, and after the successful creation of humanity within Project Anthropos, the couple would travel to Atlantis and begin experimenting on humans in hopes to create several pet creatures. However, this act would be against Poseidon's law on human experimentation, and they would be banished from the city by the Diacastes at the time, Aletheia. Juno would enter the abandoned laboratory of Consus at least 3 centuries after his death in 1923 of the Isu era, to find that he had found a way to transfer his consciousness into the prototype Shroud of Eden. Once she realized this, she would learn as much of the process as she could from him, and also informed him about the creation of the human species, something that Consus didn't think was possible. Around the beginning of the Human-Isu War in 2296 of the Isu era, Minerva, Juno, and Saturn were discussing the growing threat of the humans. During this conversation, Juno had expressed her despise for them, calling for their extermination, mocking how they tried to emulate the Isu. Minerva would argue that humanity was being more than they were intended, going so far as creating songs and art, and perhaps one day they could be treated as equals, to which Saturn would agree, just before he was suddenly stabbed in the head by one of his human servants. This act would fill Juno with rage, calling her to use the Cui Noir to kill a man who was about to strike her with Saturn's scythe, along with all the rebelling humans around them. In her grief, she would state that the humans would destroy everything, including themselves, and she would swear to deal with humanity by saving them from themselves. While the war was going on, Juno herself wasn't a fighter. She was a scientist, and as such, she worked with Jupiter and Minerva to protect her fellow Isu from the upcoming solar flare. Juno would start by having several temples built underground to start researching methods to stop or save the Isu from the upcoming flare. Each of these temples would send their findings into the Grand Temple, where Juno, Minerva, and Jupiter would sort through and test the solutions. One solution in particular, that was based off Consus's work, would see Juno's husband Aida volunteer to have his consciousness transferred into a stronger body. This would fail, and cause Aida to go catatonic, forcing Juno to euthanize him. During the course of the war, Minerva would find a potential solution to the solar flare by creating the global Aurora Borealis device. While Minerva was working on this solution, Juno would start to make plans to keep humanity from inheriting the Earth. Minerva would find out about these plans, and after Juno had shed her physical form and entered the Grand Temple's network, the Grey, she would imprison Juno's consciousness in an attempt to keep the world safe. After doing so, however, Minerva would discover that Juno had tampered with the eye that she used to make her calculations, and reach out across time. Thinking it better to keep Juno imprisoned instead of using the global Aurora Borealis device, as using its activating pedestal would release her from her imprisonment, Minerva allowed the flare to hit and kill almost all of the humans in Isu. Over the next thousands of years, the Isu members would dwindle, and some, like Minerva, would leave clues to the Grand Temple, hoping that others would be able to use it to stop the next solar flare without releasing Juno. Sometime before she was imprisoned, Juno was able to find a way to manipulate the genetic code of humans and to input a trigger that would randomly activate and alter their genetic makeup of the individual, giving them the memories of her husband Aida, and in some cases, changing their appearance, causing Aida to partially be reincarnated over and over throughout the ages. Some of these reincarnated hosts, who would end up being called sages, would stay true to Aida's love for Juno and would create cults worshipping her and calling for her return. Sometime before October 1769, the Kanataheton came into possession of a crystal ball. This piece of Eden allowed them to communicate with what they called spirits. In reality, the crystal ball allowed them to enter a nexus and communicate with Isu members. One, in particular, Ratagaheton, would use the crystal ball to communicate with Juno. She would tell him that if he did not leave his village, join the assassins, and hide an amulet in the possession of the Templars, where no one could find it, that his village would end up being destroyed. Roughly 250 years later, Juno would approach Clay Kasmeric, though this time in the Animus. Juno would tell Clay that he needed to help Desmond Miles, which Clay would blatantly refuse. But Juno would respond, telling him that that promise would be fulfilled. Clay would change his mind when he found out the truth of Lucy Stillman's allegiance to the Templars. After finding this out, Clay would commit suicide on August 8, 2012, and write messages in his blood on the walls of the room where he was stayed while at Abstergo. But before doing so, he would store his consciousness within the Animus. This consciousness would later help Desmond during his time in the Black Room of the Animus. Juno would appear 4 times to Desmond himself as he passed through the Santa Maria in Arcooli on his way to the Colosseum Vault on October 10, 2012. Speaking of her people and their vaults, eventually elaborating on the warning that Minerva had given him through Ezio. She would also call humans ignorant and would angrily regret the blending of the Isu and human bloodlines, saying that mankind should have been left as it was. When Desmond and his assassin cell reached the Apple of Eden that was housed within the vault, Juno would speak to Desmond again, saying that the final journey had commenced, and she would tell him about a woman that would accompany him. But first, the path needed to be open and the scales balanced. Juno would then use the apple to show Desmond visions of Lucy Stillman's inevitable betrayal and the failure that would come from Abstergo. After these visions, Juno would force Desmond to stab Lucy and ensure that the apple would remain with Desmond. This act would force Desmond into a coma, but once he recovered, he would head to the Grand Temple with Sean Hastings, Rebecca Crane, and his father William. Arriving on October 30th, they would approach the inner parts of the temple when Juno would urge Desmond to find the key, which would cause Desmond into a fugue state, which William would treat by placing him back in the Animus. Due to this, Desmond would start to search through the memories of his ancestors Hatham Kenway and Ratagaheton. During his breaks from the Animus, Desmond would explore the temple, getting even more face time with Juno. During each of their meetings, she would detail the ways in which the Isu tried to stop the Great Catastrophe. While Desmond was inside the Animus, she would even send him emails where she would express her anxiety over finding the key and encourage him to hurry. Though in a few emails, she would even express her distaste for humans. Desmond would find the key, retrieving it on December 20th, 2012, and the next day would enter the inner chamber of the temple where Juno would appear again and request that Desmond touch the pedestal to protect the world from the upcoming solar flare. Just before he could, though, Minerva would appear in the chamber and reveal Juno's true intention and explain to him why Juno was imprisoned and that if he activated the pedestal, Juno would be free to try again. Minerva would also explain that touching the pedestal would kill him, though Juno would try and reason with him about how, if he let the solar flare hit, that history would repeat itself. Desmond would agree with Juno for the good of the planet and believe that humanity would be able to find a way to stop her. While the other assassins escaped, Desmond would touch the pedestal, saving the Earth and losing his life in the process. After being freed, Juno would thank Desmond for playing his part, and that it was now time to play hers. While her consciousness would be free, it would have nowhere to go. But it would not be long before an Abstergo forensics team would go through the temple looking for Desmond's body. While they were there, she would be able to inhabit the equipment that they brought with them, and from there, she would spread throughout the internet to end up inhabiting a wide variety of systems that would be referred to as the Grey by John Standish, a sage, in November of 2013. John would start manipulating an Abstergo entertainment research analyst in October 2013 in an attempt to use them as a host body for Juno to inhabit. The employee would eventually find themselves in the bunker beneath Abstergo Entertainment's Montreal facility, face to face with Juno, who would say that she could feel but couldn't touch, and that she was too weak to inhabit an organic vessel. Questioning her plan, she would bless Desmond for his sacrifice, so that her children could live on to fulfill their purpose. Juno would then instruct the instruments of the first will to hunt down more samples and artifacts before she could fully return. In March of 2014, Juno would connect to Medaya Voronina, who was suffering from the bleeding effect. Medaya's daughter, Galina, would find Medaya talking about the death of Aida just before her death, at which point Juno would appear on the Animus monitors, scream, and disappear. In October of 2015, Juno would contact an assassin initiate and distract them from trying to find a Shroud of Eden by having them search through a different time period. Not only would Juno explain a bit about herself and her mission, while the initiate relived the memories of Lydia Fry, hunting down a German spy who was a sage, but Juno would also claim that her way would save the world, and that if Desmond could see it her way, then the initiate could too. Juno would then make contact with Violet DaCosta, after Violet was able to retrieve a Shroud of Eden from London, and had given it to Alvaro Grammatica, where Violet would express worry about what was coming. Juno would reassure her by saying that she would save the world. After this, Juno would send the instruments of the first will to find the Koh-i-Noor, Desmond Miles' son Elijah, and to take over Alvaro Grammatica's lab. In August of 2018, Grammatica would extract bone marrow from Elijah and use the Shroud of Eden to accelerate the maturity rate of a cloned Isu fetus that would allow Juno an adult body within 24 hours. While the body matured, Consus would appear to Juno, where the two would discuss Charlotte de la Cruz and how that her will was greater than Juno's. When the body reached maturity, Juno would comment to Grammatica about how she used to be disgusted with her vocal cords until she didn't have them for a millennia, and told him to let her out of the machine. The day she left the machine would be known as Resurrection Day, and when she did, she would find that because the Shroud of Eden was woven into the DNA of her cloned body, that she had new energetic powers that she would use to subdue and eliminate most of her enemies in the lab. While doing this, she would be approached by Conscious's spirit and would be mocked for her lack of growth and stubborn immaturity. It would shortly be discerned that it was an illusion, and Juno was really talking to a coffee mug. This illusion was made by Elijah for the death of his mother with the Koh-i-Noor. After escaping the illusion, Juno would demand that he give her the piece of Eden. Instead of receiving the Koh-i-Noor, what she did get would be Charlotte's hidden blade through her throat, ending her life for good. The remains of the body, most likely, were destroyed when Johanni Otto Berg set off a bomb within the facility. There is no denying that Juno's story is one of the most divisive among the Assassin's Creed community. There are a lot of fans that are upset that it ended within Assassin's Creed Uprising, and that some didn't even know that it ended, let alone within a comic book. Personally, I didn't mind it. I was just happy that we got an ending to it at all, as it could have just sat there hanging in the ether after Assassin's Creed Origins soft rebooted the series. As for her character in general, I thought she was a great villain. She challenged not only Desmond and the modern-day assassins, but also Desmond's ancestors, and to see her scheming across millennia and hundreds of generations is something that I haven't seen often in literature or film. If you boil her down, she is the kind of character that is fueled by racism and hate, but has the ability to manipulate those she hates into doing her bidding. I thought she was more complex than what we gave her credit for. While I would like to see more of her to help fill out the Isu and how their civilization ran and acted, I also like the air of mystery that the Isu have. We don't know everything about them, and that makes us curious to see those shadows filled in. But at the same time, can filling those shadows live up to the hype of what could be in those shadows? Thank you for joining me today. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast, and if you have any questions about Assassin's Creed or topics that you would like me to cover, please feel free to hit me up on Twitter at visions_AC, a link to which will be in the description of the podcast. I'd like to take this time and let you guys know that I have something really special coming down the pipe, something that I'm really excited for, and it's something that I can't wait to tell you guys more about. Keep an eye out on my Twitter feed just so you can get an idea on what is coming when we fully announce it. But until next time, my assassin friends, make sure to follow the creed, and to those Templars listening, may the Father of Understanding guide you.